autism rates are going up exactly in step with the rise in glyphosate. There's a stunning curve that shows children in first grade diagnosed with autism in the United States, plotting that over time against the amount of glyphosate being used on the core GMO crops over time, and over the preceding 4 years. So from the age of 2 to the age of 6 in that child's life, integrated, all of that total. Perfect match, exact match between those two curves. It's a stunning correlation coefficient, 0.99 or something like that. So correlation doesn't mean causation, but, sometimes it does. And when you see that kind of correlation, you can't ignore it. You just can't. Immediately, I was like, this is just wow. I mean, first of all, believing it because of what I'd heard from the lecture. And then on top of that, finding this incredibly strong correlation. Because I'd been looking for correlations with other things. That's how I was figuring out what might be causal. But I was striking out in the sense that I couldn't explain the mechanism by which these things would cause what I was seeing with the autism. It was such a strange disease with so many interesting things going on. How could one chemical cause all that stuff was one of the big questions. He was the one who suggested to me that it might be substituting for glycine during protein synthesis. Glycine is an amino acid. It's the smallest amino acid. It's one of the 20 building blocks of proteins. That's the DNA code. I don't know how much people know about biology. They should know this because it's very basic. But you have that 4-letter DNA code, the nucleotides that are lined up like beads on a string, and you read them off 3 at a time. And the 3 have a specific code for a particular amino acid. And then from that code, the protein is built with also beads on a string, attaching the amino acids together. That's a protein. That's called a peptide sequence, And then the protein is a whole bunch of peptide sequences put together. And each of the proteins has incredibly specific things that it does that are amazing. I mean, they're the workhorses of the body. They're enzymes and transporters and receptors, just all kinds of things that are proteins, even some hormones, So like insulin is a protein. So they're very, very important in the body. They're really central to life, and they're messed up by glyphosate through this mechanism of substituting for glycine. And if you read my book, you see that that's kind of the central story in my book.
The problem with a lot of nutrition stuff is what I'm in mainly is they stop at the correlations and then they'll make recommendations based on that. And then we see a lot of problems.
Yeah, you can get confused with it, especially with biological signaling, because you can find things that are higher under certain conditions. And you think if you can knock them down, mess up the enzymes that make that, you'll help the disease, but that doesn't turn out to be true in many cases. Homocysteine is a good example because homocysteine is elevated in the blood in association with heart disease. It's a very strong risk factor for heart disease, and they've developed drugs that can knock it down. They're so excited they can bring homocysteine levels down. Every time they try to use them, they fail miserably. They make the disease worse, So this is the kind of, and the Alzheimer's is another example, right? Amyloid beta. They're like, oh yeah, amyloid beta clearly causes Alzheimer's. Let's get rid of it. So they find these wonderful drugs, really expensive, like this new one. Mm-hmm. They get rid of the amyloid beta. They don't get rid of the Alzheimer's and make it worse usually. I mean, it's just a complete failure. Yes, and that's really central because I was seeing with the autistic kids that their gut was messed up. It was very clear their gut microbiome was messed up, and that I was looking for something that would be doing. I was thinking in terms of antibiotics for ear infections. I was working with that idea. But glyphosate is a patented antimicrobial agent. They know it kills bugs. Unfortunately, it kills the good guys much more than it kills the bad guys. So you end up with lactobacillus and bifidobacteria. Those are really two really important microbes that get a good grip on the gut when the baby's born, the infant, they need those microbes to be able to digest the milk. And those microbes are very sensitive to glyphosate. And this is really crucial because they get reduced in number, and then other microbes can grow because there's a hole. Whenever there's a vacuum, other microbes can grow. And the autistic kids have an overgrowth of Clostridia. And Clostridia are especially resistant to glyphosate. And so a very nice study showed that bifidobacteria and lactobacillus were much more sensitive than Clostridia and Salmonella. Salmonella is another one that's been causing trouble. So you end up with these toxic metabolites produced by these pathogens like Clostridia. And there are papers that have shown Clostridia overgrowth linked to autism. There was an amazing paper that involved a set of triplets, and there were 2 boys and a girl. Both boys were diagnosed with autism. The girl had a seizure disorder. All of them tested high levels of glyphosate in their urine. And the doctor who wrote the paper, it was a case study, and he observed that they had high Clostridia growth and they had Clostridia metabolites that have been shown to be linked to autism in mouse studies. They've been shown that these Clostridia produce these metabolites that are toxins that end up disrupting the brain. They actually get into the brain and disrupt the brain and cause the autistic symptoms. So that's quite striking. It has to do with dopamine getting overstimulated dopamine, because the enzyme that breaks down the dopamine is busted by the toxins that are produced by the glycidia. So there's all these complicated things that happen in biology. Amazing story, and it shows that glyphosate disrupts the pH of the gut. It makes it pH too high, which ends up disrupting the balance of these metabolites that are produced by the gut microbe, which are these small fatty acids, short chain fatty acids. There's 3 of them that are really important: butyrate, propionate, and acetate. And what's been shown in studies is that in the presence of glyphosate, acetate goes down, and butyrate depends upon, and the pH goes up, and butyrate depends on low pH. So you end up with too little butyrate and too much acetate. Acetate goes up, butyrate goes down. And propionate in particular goes way up. And propionate is the one that's hooked to autism. It's really fascinating. Just this simple thing of these little fatty acids, you can't imagine that it could be so important. It's a 1-chain, 2-chain, and 3-chain. They're very short fatty acids, super important. They're made by the gut microbes. And the butyrate is the fuel for the colonocytes that line the gut barrier. So when there's not enough butyrate, the colonocytes get sick, you get a leaky barrier, and then you get all kinds of problems. And on top of that, it messes up the digestion of the proteins, because that depends upon those bacteria that are getting killed off. The lactobacillus and the bifidobacteria help the host to digest milk. So when the infant is nursing, it gets these complicated milk proteins. These bacteria have specialized enzymes that we don't have. There's so much that the gut microbes have in the way of extra enzymes that are not in the human host. They make all these B vitamins as well, and these come out of that shikimate pathway. And the products of the shikimate pathway itself are the aromatic amino acids, which are essential for the proteins. Those are 3 of those coding amino acids. So those get reduced because the microbes that make them, the pathway they used to make them is getting wrecked by glyphosate. That's that shikimate pathway. So critical metabolites that are normally produced by the microbes are insufficient. They're deficient. And critical other metabolites that are produced by the pathogens are toxic. So you get this awful mess of the gut being all messed up. And these kids have bloating, they have diarrhea, they have constipation, all these symptoms evident of gut dysbiosis in the autistic kids. Well known, well established. And it's really just that the glyphosate is messing everything up. It's a very difficult space because there are so many of them, and they're so different from person to person. Everybody has their unique gut microbiome. And they're helping you out. And often I think the microbes are growing to help to compensate for what else is going on. They're trying to adjust to the situation to optimize the health of the host, but they have a hard time doing that when they're being poisoned by glyphosate, basically. And when they make these processed foods, they're basically thinking of fats, proteins, and carbs, right? Fats, proteins, and carbs. And what they're leaving out are all these complicated molecules that are produced by plants. You have, if you take herbs and spices and even just, regular plants, they produce these very interesting polyphenolic compounds, things that are called polyphenols or flavonoids or terpenoids. These are very beneficial antioxidant molecules that are quite complicated. They're beautiful looking with lots of circles and stuff. They're amazingly complex, these molecules and there's an enormous number of them. And so eating a lot of herbs and spices is a really good idea, because then you're getting all of these complicated molecules. When they make a soy protein bar, there's none of them in there. They're gone. It's just the simple nutrients. So they're not thinking in terms of all these molecules that are really beneficial to our health in ways that we didn't appreciate. And chlorophyll actually you can eat chlorophyll and your cells can make use of it to help with the mitochondria. It's quite extraordinary. I found a paper on that. I mean, it's just, we don't realize all these things that are in our natural foods that are stripped out when we make these processed foods. Whoa. And so when we eat only processed foods, those things become deficient. Yeah, well, just the micronutrient deficiencies that you get when you're eating foods that are impoverished in micronutrients. And a lot of these, like flour and sugar, right? There's no micronutrients in there. Those are so basic foods that have lost all of their nutritional value. In fact, they put things back into the flour. They try. So they add things back that are probably bad, like the folate. The folic acid that they require in the flour. Bad idea, because it's not the natural form of folate that you really need. Folic acid doesn't work.
Same thing with iron.
Oh, we just put that in.
Iron too. Iron. Yeah. They try to iron. Yeah, they add it back in. It's not good.
It's not the right form, because you have really the natural form in which iron is able to be handled correctly. In fact, heme iron, from the meats is so different from just the iron that's added added back into the foods. They think they can just put vitamins back in. Look at the cereal box and it has all these vitamins supplemented to 100% of the daily requirement of all these vitamins. That's not real. I mean, it's just they put those back in. It's heavily processed. It's not natural. And I think people don't realize to what extent we're able to utilize the energy in the sun for very good purposes. It catalyzes enzymes that do very important things. And I've talked about it in my book, but one of the things I believe is happening is that when you get sunlight exposure to the eyes, it's reaching the pineal gland, which is right behind the eyes. And the pineal gland is a very interesting gland. It's called the seat of the soul. It's very mystical. And it's the one that controls sleep. It makes the melatonin, that helps you sleep. And we've got an epidemic of sleep disorder as well. But the pineal gland responds to sunlight. So if you get sunlight in the morning, the pineal gland starts making sulfate. It makes sulfate in response to sunlight. And then it uses that sulfate at night and hooks it onto the melatonin molecules that it ships out into the cerebral spinal fluid. So it's making melatonin sulfate and putting it into the cerebral spinal fluid that's supplying the brain with sulfate as well as with melatonin. And those are both really critical to help the brain clear cellular debris, which is what you do while you're sleeping. So it really helps you sleep, but it also helps you keep your brain healthy because you could clear those amyloid beta plaques if you had enough melatonin sulfate. And
just going on the sun will produce cholesterol sulfate.
Yeah, that's right. And that's the critical one. Cholesterol sulfate is what I write a lot about in my papers. I believe it's a very important molecule, and I believe it is derailed by glyphosate because the enzyme that makes, there's an enzyme called endothelial nitric oxide synthase, which makes nitric oxide. But I believe it also makes sulfur dioxide. It's a moonlighting enzyme, it's called. It makes two things, and it depends on where it is and the circumstances as to which one it makes. It's a kind of a yin and a yang. And those two actually work together to keep the blood circulation at the right viscosity level. It's really fascinating science. And it relates to the fourth phase of water because the sulfate structures the water and makes the gel that lines the blood vessels, and that allows the red blood cells to slip through the capillaries with very little friction. So really important to have the sulfate. In fact, it's cholesterol sulfate that's produced in the skin in response to sunlight. And then the cholesterol sulfate is released into the blood, and it can travel freely in the blood. It doesn't have to be packaged up inside an LDL particle. So when you're not making enough cholesterol sulfate, your liver is compelled to release more LDL particles, and your LDL goes up. And that's the one that gets you on a statin drug. So I think that high cholesterol is a consequence of low cholesterol sulfate. Right. And of course, oxidized LDL is the thing that's, damaging. Oxidized LDL is what will cause you to end up with cholesterol accumulating in the arteries that supply the heart. And I have some very interesting theories about that as well, that has to do with your heart is actually squirreling away cholesterol in its arteries because it desperately needs cholesterol. It's waiting for sulfate in order to get the cholesterol delivered. And the sulfate gets delivered at the same time. So both the cholesterol and the sulfate are supporting each other to help them travel through the blood. Neither one of them does a good job of traveling through the blood without the other. You put them together and they have a much easier time to get around, which allows them to be distributed throughout your body. And when they arrive at a destination, they break apart, and the sulfate goes into the extracellular matrix, and the cholesterol goes into the membrane, and the cell is very happy to receive both of them. Cholesterol is not a toxin. It is an essential nutrient. It's vital to health, and it's only found in animals. Plants don't have cholesterol, which is interesting. It's vital to health, and it's only found in animals. Plants don't have cholesterol, which is interesting. It's an animal-based essential molecule, and it's really what gives us, I think, a brain, and it gives us mobility. It's essential for the muscles in the brain in particular.
Well, and I think immune system too. I think that there's
Yes, absolutely. And the sulfate as well for the immune system. And I think that's one of the reasons why glyphosate derails the innate immune system is because it disrupts heparin sulfate. I write a lot about heparin sulfate in my book. Very, very interesting molecule that lines all the blood vessels and makes the blood healthy. And the sulfation, the degree of sulfation of the heparin sulfate has a tremendous influence on what happens in the blood. So you need to have a lot of sulfate to make the blood healthy. And that's also involved in the metabolism of a broken molecule. So when molecules get damaged by sugar or by oxygen, they need to be removed and degraded and then turned into something useful that can start over again, building blocks, And this happens in the lysosomes, and the lysosomes depend upon heparin sulfate for that to work. So when the heparin sulfate is deficient, it's hard for the cells to recycle debris. So the debris piles up. And something like amyloid beta is a really big debris molecule that you want to get rid of in Alzheimer's. And if you can't, because you don't have enough sulfate, you're going to get Alzheimer's.
Arteries. Yes,
and it's so interesting because it gets glycated and oxidized because of this inability to supply enough sulfate. You need the reactive oxygen species to make the sulfate, and they damage the LDL. And the LDL can be packaged up inside an LDL particle safely if there's enough sulfate to surround it. So you actually put cholesterol sulfate is in the membrane of the LDL particle, and the sulfate makes the gelled water around it. And the gelled water is like a shield that keeps glycation damage away. So the LDL particle becomes healthy if it's got enough sulfate, enough cholesterol sulfate in particular, in its membrane. The cholesterol sulfate goes into the membrane, puts the sulfate out into the water, into the blood, and it makes this nice gelled water shield that's called exclusion zone water, because nothing can get in. And that's beautiful because then you can't get the damage. It's safe. So without the sulfate, it's not safe. It gets oxidized, it gets glycated, it gets damaged, it goes into the artery wall to cause heart disease. And that's because of insufficient sulfate. I think sulfate deficiency is a primary driver behind heart disease.
Getting sun without sunscreen.
Yep, without sunscreen, without sunglasses, because you can help your brain, sulfate supply in your brain by having sun exposure to your eyes. I think it's very important. And I always was outside a lot, and I got a lot of sun in the spring, and I got a tan. By the time the summer sun came along, the tan protected me. I mean, a tan is a really good protection against burning. But you never get a tan if you're always wearing sunscreen. So the minute you forgot your sunscreen, you're in trouble, right? You're on the boat, it's the bright sun, you have no sunscreen, and you've been protecting yourself all the while, so your skin is white. Now you're in really big trouble. But you need to just build up your own resistance during the periods when the sun isn't as strong, so you can handle the summer sun. And I'm not saying go out and burn yourself, of course, but just to get, certainly if you take a walk in the morning in the bright sunlight for an hour or 45 minutes, that's a good start, Melanoma skin cancer has been going up over time, exactly in step with the rise in the use of sunscreen. We're getting stronger and stronger, levels of sunscreen with these sun protection factors of like 65, right? When I was a kid, it was like 8 was high, we had like maybe 4 and 8, and now it's like 65. I mean, it's just crazy, the degree of sun protection they're offering. And they've got aluminum in them, which is really toxic. It's going to absorb through the skin. It's going to mess up, actually. The enzyme enos gets messed up by aluminum. So when you put aluminum-based sunscreen on the skin, you're messing up the enzymes that would make the cholesterol sulfate. So you're really screwing things up with the sunscreen. But it is true that the sunscreen can deceive you into thinking that you're not burning, and so you stay out too long, right? Because you think I'm fine, and you don't look like you're burning. You don't get the signals because the sunscreen is blocking them. And I think that may be one way in which the UV becomes more dangerous, because it's really kind of surprising that that we're not solving the problem that the sunscreen is supposed to solve, which is to prevent this cancer, right? The whole point of the sunscreen is to prevent melanoma. And it's doing the opposite. I mean, people should know that. It's doing the opposite. The literature tells you that. Pharma has gotten it all so wrong. I just feel like there's almost nothing they're getting right, and all their drugs, all the drugs that they're using to treat depression and anxiety, they're causing all kinds of horrendous symptoms in the people who are taking them. And of course, the opioid drugs that are causing addiction and just huge problems with the prescription drugs. I think pharma's in a really bad place, I feel. Yes, well, the shikimate pathway is not found in human cells. That's correct. And that was the big deal that Monsanto advertised to say this chemical is wonderful because we don't have the pathway. It's a particular enzyme in the pathway that they've singled out as being especially sensitive to glyphosate, which is called EPSP synthase. And that's a critical enzyme in the pathway. When that's broken, lots of things go south. And the plants absolutely depend on that pathway, in part to make all those beautiful polyphenolic compounds that I mentioned earlier. Those things come out of the shikimate pathway. It makes that basic benzene ring that is central to so much of biology. And the output of the shikimate pathway, these aromatic amino acids, those are precursors to a whole bunch of hormones like serotonin, melatonin, melanin, the skin tanning agent. So that's another thing. If melanin is deficient, then you're going to be more sensitive to the sun. And so glyphosate is going to make melanin deficient by virtue of blocking that pathway that provides the precursors to make the melanin. So the melanin, melatonin, serotonin, dopamine, epinephrine, which is adrenaline, all of those basic hormones, they all come out of the shikimate pathway, as well as thyroid hormone. So we have a lot of issues with the thyroid that I think is also connected to this disruption of the shikimate pathway, and certain B vitamins. So niacin and riboflavin come out of the shikimate pathway, and also vitamin K2. So these are all going to be affected by the disruption of the shikimate pathway in the gut microbiome, which is providing us with these B vitamins. I mean, again, I don't think we realized how much we were depending upon them. We think of the nutrients coming from the food, which is true. And of course, it's also going to be depleted in the foods that are exposed to glyphosate. So we're getting less from the food, but we're also getting less from the microbes. And the microbes are really a major player in supplying us with these critical nutrients. We hadn't appreciated that until we found out that they were broken. And then we started to see these diseases appearing that are connected to deficiencies in these things that the gut microbiome used to supply and isn't supplying adequately anymore. Right. And, women have a real problem these days with pelvic pain. There's a lot of women who are suffering from bladder issues and fibroids, like the uterus is overproducing these extra uterine materials, endometriosis, all these and reproductive issues, all these things, I think they're being caused by glyphosate, and there's increasing numbers of women are complaining about this kind of pain in the pelvis. And sometimes they take out the uterus and the pain doesn't go away. Then they realize it's actually the bladder. I mean, it's like those organs, their membranes are also get leaky, just like the gut gets leaky. So glyphosate causes a leaky gut barrier, but it also causes leaky barriers in both the uterus and in the bladder to cause health issues there that can be very painful. So there's all these weird problems that women are complaining about, and the doctors don't understand where it's coming from. It's a mysterious disease, and they don't know how to treat it. And the women are suffering greatly, and they're not getting treated. Then they don't know how to fix it. And the way to fix it is to switch to an organic diet. And there's actually testimony from someone. There was a guy who contacted me a few years back, said his wife was suffering from this interstitial cystitis, and a lot of pain, and she just couldn't fix it. And then I told him, put her on an organic diet. And he got back to me a year later, said it totally worked. It was a miracle. He has an article where he talks about this, my wife, and she was really, her problems were completely fixed by just going to an organic diet.
I'm wondering if a lot of the benefits people are getting is from getting less glyphosate.
I've wondered that myself, and I think that may be true, because obviously animals are one step away from plants, right? The plants are getting the glyphosate directly, and the animals are getting it indirectly. And if you're eating grass-fed beef, it's probably going to be very low in glyphosate. You hope that the grass is not being exposed to glyphosate. GMO foods are resistant to glyphosate, but many of the non-GMO foods are sprayed with glyphosate right before harvest as a desiccant to kill the plant. The intent is to kill the plant, make it go to seed, increase the yield, maybe chasing a frost, trying to beat the frost. So there's maybe compelling reasons to do it, but they end up with lots of glyphosate in the food. And that's why we have an epidemic in celiac disease, because wheat is one of those foods that's sprayed right before harvest as a desiccant. Yeah, well, it is gluten, but the gluten is contaminated with glyphosate, and also the microbes that break down the gluten, the same ones that break down the milk, the casein in milk, they also break down the gluten. They have these specialized enzymes that deal with this proline. Proline is a very difficult amino acid to break apart from the chain, and the lactobacillus have these specialized enzymes that break it apart. So the lactobacillus gets killed off by glyphosate, and then the enzymes aren't sufficient to break down the protein, so the proteins stick around, and they don't get digested. And you have the leaky gut that glyphosate also sets up. So the proteins get out into circulation, and the immune cells get really angry when they see these wayward gluten proteins in the wrong place. They develop antibodies, and then those antibodies attack your own tissues through something called molecular mimicry. So you end up attacking certain enzymes that cause you to have the symptoms of gluten intolerance and celiac disease.